Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching with myself, Mark Carroll. In today's episode, I want to revisit a topic that came up recently for me in two ways. One, that actually not so long ago, I had an academic, Mark Parkinson, on the show. If you look back at the episode around rethinking coaching philosophy, where we actually discussed a recent paper that Mark had done alongside, I think, Chris Cushion as well, revisiting a critical analysis of coaching philosophy, deconstruction to reconstruction, wherein the authors presented a sort of metaphysical view of coaching that I think is just fantastic, that starts to kind of bring sort of terminology to light that I don't think a lot of practitioners on the ground outside of academic circles are used to encountering, where there was phrases thrown up like ontology, epistemology, axiology, and stuff like that. And it's something, to be honest, I've looked at for quite a while actually in my own teaching. And actually, now that we're at the beginning of term, bringing me to my second reason for this episode, and I've been putting together my slides for my students, and I can't wait to start talking about pedagogy and style acquisition. Being an outsider still, and I suppose you might still call me an enthusiastic amateur in this realm, being a coach for a long while, and certainly but certainly not a researcher in style acquisition, but someone who's had a lived experience of still learning and still coaching, coupled with, I suppose, my more centric view on motivational psychology. But I have always had a bit of an interest in this sort of space for all its bewilderment and all of its fixation on semantics. There often is sometimes noted within that anarchy, some little bits of truth and some bits of wisdom that could be gleaned. And I think this sort of conversation on how we actually look at and think about still at a higher order way, at a higher order level, I think could be really helpful. So just as I was getting ready for term, I started to kind of put together some stuff on this, and I thought I would chat through it today. For anyone else who's maybe like, what on earth are you talking about? And maybe we can chat about this. Why, I suppose for starters, why should we be considering metaphysics and coaching? As a bit of a quick recap for those who don't have time just yet to revisit the episode that I recorded with Mark, or to have a look at some of my previous episodes. I have spoken about it in the past with some other people as well. I think maybe in an interview with John Lyle as well, way back when, that we kind of spoke a little bit about some of this stuff, certainly when we got into talking like pragmatism and stuff like that. So often within a coach's sort of philosophy, if it's not something that necessarily they've written down on paper, but something they carry with them in their day-to-day practice, they have, or at least we believe that we have, quite a firm footing on how we see the way skill is attained and how we maybe see the way in which our pedagogy should ensue as a result of that. But and this is maybe just as a means of allowing you to validate that, or perhaps just to poke at it a little bit to see if there are any gaps in the way you've been thinking about it. There is quite a wide track of questions that could be had around that when we bring metaphysics into the conversation. So this is where, again, going back to the phrase of ontology, of epistemology, I'm actually going to add also methodology and axiology, how they can come back into it. And the reason for doing that isn't just one to make sure that you have an understanding of the various levels of your coaching process and how they tie together, but also to actually check, do they tie together, and are there actually inconsistencies? Because quite often we have a bad habit, I think, in coaching for saying one thing and doing another without intention. Sometimes, adaptive expertise is a real thing and we need to flex. That's maybe a pragmatic ontology there, and maybe getting ahead of myself, but some of us maybe don't do that actually, and that's fine. But I just mean in terms of being purposeful in our practice, it's quite important, I think, sometimes to check in and have these conversations with ourselves where we do sort of think about what we're doing and kind of make sure that it does track out across the various levels. So let's sort of explain each of those sort of four dimensions, if you will. Okay, so ontology. So ontology really means, like, it's essentially what's the nature of reality. So what is truth in coaching? Okay, so we can have a view on the world, which is the sense of what is reality, what is true, what is not true, and then how that sort of, and that's maybe the sort of base of this. Let's call it a pyramid as an analogy. So the base of the analogy, we've got that ontological view. And then one tier up from the base of the pyramid, you would have your epistemology, which is, well, if we know that ontology is the nature of reality, the nature of truth, epistemology, which is almost essentially the theory of knowledge, is how do we access that truth? So how do we access the world as understood through our ontological lens? Okay, and then again, one step up from that is the methodology, which is then, okay, how do we engage with that epistemology in a sense, or in a coaching, like how can coaches engage with their practice with an understanding of how they coin the nature of knowledge and learning in their athletes, and how that they feel is a byproduct of the nature of reality as it concerns their athletes. So again, maybe is it contradictive? Maybe that I'm thinking about this relative to coaching. Some people would say so, but that we're getting ecological psychology probably. But I'm just for this conversation, to be honest, going to talk about the cosmic reality and things like that. I don't think. Let's just keep it bounded to coaching somewhat, and I am just going on record of admitting to the relativism of perhaps I'm saying I don't know. There's not enough time in the day to waste on that, I think, for the moment being. So then you have that view there, and at the highest end of the pyramid, now actually it's funny I'm saying this because maybe you invert this, because axiology is actually to do with values and the ethics that guide our practice. Let's sort of, if you look back at, this is how I perceive reality. This is my ontological view, right? This is how I think we access that reality insofar as the nature of knowledge and learning. To then, okay, this is the methodologies that emit out of that epistemological viewpoint, and is what I'm going to do in order to access that knowledge. And as I do it, these are the values that I'm going to carry with me. Now, it's up to you, actually, as a listener. Do you want to invert that pyramid and actually maybe axiology is at the bottom? Maybe. There's maybe a wee argument for that, to be honest. I mean, in some sense, your axiology is going to justify your epistemology, and your epistemology should justify your ontology, and it's a two-way street as well. So the ontology needs to justify the epistemology. And we need to see harmony between our ontological view of reality and the values, i.e. the axiological traces of that ontology within our behaviour. So we should see harmony in that. It wouldn't really make sense if we didn't, because your axiology is what you value. We would be actively or accidentally anyway acting against our own view of reality if we don't have these things in check. So maybe that's just the first point on that. So again, I'm not just to be talking in riddles here just for the sake of sounding clever. The whole idea of this is I want to actually just go through a few different ontological views. Now, we might even coin this as paradigms. So paradigms is sort of at the nut of it, what we're actually looking at. And I've got 5 different paradigms in mind that I'm going to speak about that have spoken to me at various levels, and certainly it's at various stages of my practice. And I say stages because I believe my practice has evolved over the years to sort of, if not shift paradigm, to look to inhabit or to incorporate other paradigms where that is allowed. Again, people might come after me and say that there isn't. There's some of them there's more malleability than others, and that is true. But also in sort of understanding the imperfect, eh, principles of coaching. There's also times where you do flats, and again, maybe I'm maybe trying as a result of this, I'm trying very hard not to reveal it until later on. But there is a pragmatism, I think, within coaching that can't be ignored. But that is where people might decide that. So as I say this, I'm going to run through each paradigm. And just to share some of the tenets of it, and try and maybe hopefully show you how they link across the different threads of thinking around this. So from ontology to epistemology to methodology to axiology. And then for you as a listener, as a coach, you can then decide for yourself how much are you in agreement with one particular paradigm, or can you see a relationship between paradigms, or can you chart your own journey of thought as a coach and the way you think about coaching and the way you've experienced coaching from previous years till now? Is there maybe a paradigm that you haven't considered previously that you want to go and explore further? So that's the purpose of today, is just to give that information. Okay, and again, I say this and I really do need to put an asterisk as an enthusiastic amateur in the world of still acquisition, not being a researcher in the space, but certainly being someone who's lived and breathed the actual doing of it in the real world, and I think for that reason, importantly, is trying to sort of find the practical utility in things like metaphysics that sometimes can feel glued to a piece of paper and very difficult to think of in any way that's not abstract. I'm going to try my best with that, and I'm going to be unapologetically imprecise perhaps in certain moments, because as I say, I'm going to take what's on paper and sometimes intended too idealistically to maybe be what I think it has to be in order to find its way into a coaching conversation. So I'm going to say that. So, very first one, in I'm saying no particular order. There's a slight method to the way I'm going to try and explain these as I see it, but I'll try my best. So, the very first one's constructivism that I'm going to speak about. So, constructivism, you might hear this sort of within sort of educational theory and sometimes things like that. So, as a paradigm, constructivism, sort of the ontological view of it is that reality is socially constructed and it's individually interpreted. So it sort of looks as this, therefore, the process of still learning within sport as being subjective and context dependent. We would maybe see that we see learning as how can we affect people's schemas, the ways that they've thought of things, and then through an interaction with ourselves and the environment, and then their own reflection of that experience, how that can sort of cause good upheaval and then also modifications to that existing schema, and it's just this ongoing iterative process, a repeated process rather of us and our athletes individually interpreting what they're going through, and with our help, bringing with that new information is in a social practice. So at the ontological edge, yeah, it's reality socially constructed, individually interpreted, skill levels seen as subjective, it's context dependent, and then in order to how we then think about that insofar as how do we access that reality, as I've said, we look at knowledge as something that we actively construct with the learner through reflection and the learner considering prior experiences, and importantly, as I say, the social interaction. So learning is seen as a social exercise in this way. So coaching might, and still coaching, it should be seen as a social interaction in this way of the coach with experiences that they can lend to help the athlete make sense of their own experiences, and together through that we can co-create in some sort of way or construct knowledge that's going to help them in improving. At the methodological level of that, then we're working our way down. Coaching is less about prescribing, because that is devoid of interaction with other people, and more is facilitating, so that we can create opportunities for conversation in a lot of ways. I mean, some people might think of coaching as just opportunities for conversation. It's opportunities to think about things and to discuss things as we interact with our environment. So what the coach will do is, when you use questions, how did you feel about that guided discovery, where we allow the athlete to sort of find solutions themselves and to come to have thoughts on it. So we're really trying to create an environment that's apt for discovered learning, but apt, importantly, as a result of that, for the reappraisal of information as an athlete goes through the various sort of scaffolded practices, where they're being supported bit by bit to understand something more and more. And the coach's job is to scaffold that practice to help them in moving through those stages of learning and coming upon different discoveries of some sort. So the coach is very active in this role, but not necessarily, and can be still pushing the athlete towards certain endpoints somewhat, but they are certainly trying to show respect for the athlete's perspective. And I'm kind of jumping ahead to axiology here, but yeah, we are in a sense trying to help the athletes build personal meaning around the skills that we want them to develop. So the coaches that are maybe at the end of a session, bringing their athletes there to speak to them about things, coaches who interject during a session perhaps, and they lead through questioning and not telling, but they asked. That's someone who recognises that there's a sense making process to knowledge that can only be accessed through social interaction, through discussion, through reflection on experiences. So that sort of thing, and constructing it with me as the coach. So someone who operates in that way, really, if you think that matters to you, then you really need to consider and keep at all times close to you and at the forefront of what you do and how you think about things. It's about personal growth, about learner autonomy. Even looking a little bit into my area, you should be thinking about how can I give athletes the sense of ownership over their development? How can I build respect for their perspective? Asking them questions and knowledge and things about what they're feeling, how they're thinking at the time. Even carrying that into a rationale is a really useful way of real co-construction of knowledge. So it's not just, okay, is that what you think? No, well, this is how it actually works. Well, I understand the way you're thinking. That could play a role in this way, or if it doesn't, this is why you might be experiencing that right now, or you're building their thought process and the thought journey they need to take ownership of and go through into the dialogue that you have with them, so that you're not you're not a gatekeeper of knowledge and progress. You are instead sort of a tour guide, if you want to call it that. I don't know if that's really bad phrasing or not, but you're someone that's essentially showing them a little bit about some of this stuff and allowing them opportunities to ask you questions as they move through their own museum, if you will, their own sort of building, their own sort of landmark, because because they are both exhibiting still, but also they are constructing still in many ways too. So they are the exhibit as well as the visitor. So think of it a little bit in that way. I know that's a horrible attempt at trying to put these things together, but it's just how I was thinking about it there on the cuff. So constructivism. So that's one approach. Maybe what I'll do now is now go to the opposite. Could be seen as an opposite, and I'm only saying that at the moment. Let's think of these things as caricatures and in complete contrast, so only so we can help ourselves understand the differences. Then we'll go back to actually recognising they aren't caricatures, but just bear with me, just as a thought exercise at the moment. The next paradigm that I would bring up then is behaviourism. So behaviourism is very different, I suppose, from a constructivist ontological view, because a behaviourist sees reality as external and objective, and there are set ways that of things being how they are, and I suppose in coaching quarters that's might be quite a overt reliance and belief in the sort of physics of still, and therefore behaviour can be observed, it can be measured, and it can be shaped by stimuli and responses, kind of like athletes are like an animal that you train. I'm not meaning to say it as if like they mean an athlete, but it's that sort of like how you train a dog, but in a much more as applied to humans, I suppose. So the way we think about this then, in terms of how we can access that reality and the way that we can learn about it and learn through it, is that we then need to think from an epistemological point of view, is that knowledge comes as a set of conditioned responses that are formed through repetition of tasks and also reinforcement, in terms of positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, rewarding things, athletes when they're doing something well, or discouraging things that they're not doing so well. So again, if you think about this, within a coaching light, and maybe we think of sport and skillful performance within sport as being very postural, perhaps, if it's sort of guarded by physics in some sense, then it's about how do we keep athletes into the correct posture, and in that, on the right, not fall off the wagon, or going outside of the lines of what we expect them to do, because now it's a bit more clear cut. I mean, there are things we need to teach the athletes, not so much talk to them around, but teach them. We can talk to them around it in order to teach them, but there is no open conclusion that we would allow for so much in the same way as maybe a constructivism paradigm might say allow for. So reality is external, it's objective in behaviorism. It's about we can shape it through stimuli and response. At the epistemological level, it's conditioned responses, it's formed through reinforcement, repetition. So then at the methodology, the ground level for coaches, therefore, if that's something you think about and believe, then that's where we would see the use of drills coming in. So just drills by essence, they're fairly controlled, they're organised, they allow for compartmentalisation. If we maybe want to, look at a specific element of still, they allow for repetition, which is maybe part of the reason why you often see drills that are focused on specific things, because we believe it's more postural then, it's trying to look at things at a close level, and it's about feedback. That was good, not so good, go back to this, and reinforcement, in order to sort of get the desired behaviours that you like and to eliminate errors. Now, coaches can still ask questions. As I'm saying, it's not quite a caricature, but now you get you get the feeling for it. I can now sort of spread out to offer a bit more nuance. We can still ask questions of our athletes, but it's always with the intention of reinforcing the beliefs of the coach about how to posturally carry out a still, or I suppose if we're not even necessarily thinking about still in its most narrow sense of technical behaviours and with a ball, or technical behaviours in a swimming pool and the strokes that you're doing. It might be even at a tactical perspective that, there are certain metrics that we need to aim for. There are certain things that we need to do, and we try to reinforce that over time through, again, going, maybe it's playing back videos, maybe it's showing what went wrong, this sort of thing, and telling the athlete and keeping them within a very set game model. It could be that sort of level, that strategic level. If you want to think about it like that, it's easier, I think, for the purpose of this, to think about it more in the technical performance and still. Um, maybe not actually. Maybe as I start to walk through some of these other ones, that you'll start to see the coupling of some of these things anyways. But I do digress. I just say it just in case it helps clarify a little bit of that. So then the sort of axiological level, which is again is about values, ethics, that sort of stuff. Now this is someone who again must value discipline, value the efficiency and the control over matters within a coaching process. And I suppose the main ethical concern at that point becomes about how we balance our effectiveness as coaches with respect for athlete autonomy and their motivation to keep up with that process that we have, because it maybe becomes a little bit about contracting. It's like, right, look, I as the coach understand that the correct way of how these things need done, and I will respect how you feel at different points of that journey, but as long as you understand why we're moving through it in this way, and and why it's quite coach directed in this way, that that might be the next best thing that you can do in order to sort of protect that sort of intrinsic motivation to keep down that path, because it isn't very athlete centered. As I say, it's a fairly coach centered view and approach to coaching through a behavioural lens, a behaviourist lens, with a behaviourism paradigm in mind. So two different sides of the fence there. Pragmatism, I'm just going to come on to pragmatism next. I wasn't sure whether or not I could bring it to it last. So pragmatism is essentially, it treats reality as being plural. There's multiple versions in some sense, but more that it's situational. Sometimes it's often, pragmatism is about what actually works in practice, and what works in practice to a pragmatist coach, to a pragmatic coach. What works in practice is, from an ontological lens, what defines as being real or relevant for learning. So a coach with a pragmatic hat on, they look at knowledge and judge it by its practical consequences and its usefulness in helping them solve problems with their athletes. So, like for me, if I'm a coach, that, you know what, I really value game based learning. And football quarters, that meaning, learning where it's we play the game and it's 3v3s or game related practices, whatever, and it's 3v3s, and that helps me by and large get me the most out of my athletes, I feel, and it's how by and large I think they learn. But at times, maybe there's an issue with one of my athletes that they just don't understand how to receive the ball from a certain angle in a certain way. It helps me to do a drill that's decontextualized, even if it doesn't necessarily become as representative of the game anymore, and that in the most extreme way that we can think of what representative practice needs to be. But I do it because it allows me and it's useful to me for explaining something to the athlete and for the athlete to grasp something and take back into the game. So it's kind of like I pick and choose when I want to do certain practices that go outside of the main way that I might otherwise do things, with all things considered. So it allows for a customization of approach. Coaches, therefore, they actually might, even for the athlete itself, themselves, encourage experimentation, problem solving, and how they can be adaptive. They might as well consider, you might consider how you can transfer skills that can be applied flexibly in game context. So in the teaching of skills, you could, think about how the technique of chipping the ball in a shooting context could be similar to the technique of chipping the ball in a passing context. So, and I know I'm using a football example, there's probably better examples that could be given, but it's just that if I need to go into that, then I will. In the same way how I want to even feedback on performance, if one athlete, if I want feel wants to, and if I feel it's better for me as well as a coach and how we work together to talk about a skill in its sort of mechanical form in the way that it's done, I might. But with other athletes, maybe I go a bit differently, and it's more, or maybe the same athlete but with a different skill, a different problem. I need to actually instead focus their attention on not so much what the leg's doing, but the effect the leg has on where the ball goes. Just that pragmatist is going to be willing to do that. Okay, and it's sort of like working out of heuristics in coaching, where we're trying to do the best with what we have. I think that's quite an apt way of thinking about coaching. So I mentioned it for that reason as well. The idea of pragmatism, you will often probably hear this more often, like on the football, in the TV, we're talking about pragmatic views and approaches to the game. But let's think about it as well in terms of pragmatic views of and ways of trying to teach skills to athletes. Obviously, therefore, pragmatists, they value the adaptability, They value the sort of ethical focus being on preparing athletes for real world challenges. So a pragmatist doesn't really think about things, and they don't deal so much with abstract ideals in their practice. They essentially just going back to it. They want to know what works. And it's might be seen as an imperfect science, but that's probably because the pragmatist understands coaching goes beyond being a science and it's more an art. And there's also a philosophical side to it as well, as I suppose we're getting at here. So that's what a pragmatist would be and how you think about it in that sense. Then there's the embodiment theory is another sort of way of another paradigm that we might attach to coaching. And I really like this, and it's interesting because as I've become someone who's become more involved in participating in sport and no longer just coaching it, it's reminded me that the thinking about still and the actual physical, sensory and sort of effective experience of doing still and actually being in sport, that they are inseparable. And I think as coaches, sometimes we get it. Now, I'm not going to impose my view on you, but I suppose my own personal view is that we can sometimes get it wrong of thinking only about the mind and what's correct, and maybe not always appreciating the feel and the embodied experience of that. And that's what embodiment is around. It's that reality is lived and experienced through the body. And the mind and the body are one, so therefore we have to think about still learning as both a bodily experience and also a cognitive experience. So how we access that, therefore, knowledge is then going to sort of emerge from that bodily engagement with the environment. So, and it's a really nice example of this. I think if you meet like a martial artist, a black belt, or these people that are fifth and sixth dan black belts in their martial art, these people are masters of their body as well as the mind. So they understand so much about the different moves and different elements of their art, but also the feeling and and their attunement to their body and what the body requires in any one moment, how they adjust based on that sort of proprioceptive and sort of kinesthetic awareness. It's so attuned and so masterful, and that's a really good example, I think, of the way still can be coined in that sense. So if you're a coach that has that value, how you access, and let's not get to the value just yet. If you're that coach that has that ontological lens and that sort of epistemological view and recognise that it goes beyond just abstract reasoning to how we learn and how knowledge emerges, that is through the bodily experience with the environment, then your methodology for coaching is going to be that you often might design sessions that would emphasise that sort of kinesthetic awareness, the feeling of doing exercises, the feeling of really connecting. So I think a lot about, and you would feed back in such a way that sort of takes into account things like rhythm and sensory feedback, the feeling. So like if you think about holistic focus of attention in some way, like where there's like you're telling an athlete as they drive a golf club to think about the feeling of the swing, to think about the sound almost of it as they connect with the ball in the sweet spot. They'll know that themselves, and it's a really powerful mechanism for them to be able to actually regulate what they're doing and for them to be active and engaged in their learning process. So like these sorts of things are quite interesting, they're important. It can also sort of move to the point of what I suppose in the next level of this, to keep the momentum going, someone with an embodiment theory and paradigm that they keep in mind, they're going to obviously value that sort of holistic athlete mind-body unity and their well-being and the authenticity of their movement. So they might not be as guarded so much about how the still looks. They still can, of course, and there might be a blueprint, but they will really want the athlete to tap into how do they feel as they do the still and what makes sense for them and their body, and maybe respecting actually some of the bodily diversity that exists as well. So, and the different experiences that can be built, that the body goes through, and how that could be reflected upon together. And it's that sort of coaching, and I think it's quite an organic way of coaching, and it's quite an interesting way of coaching that I think maybe gets pushed down a little bit if we aren't currently engaged in sport, or aren't making a focused effort to still appreciate the acting and the doing of sport as a bodily experience and not just one of the mind, because we constantly are told in coach education to think about decision making and to coach our athletes in decision making. But do we ever actually talk to our athletes and teach them to talk to us and talk to themselves about the feeling of sport and the feeling of technical and tactical execution, and the physical feeling of it is an interesting thing. The affective experience as well, and coming into how they feel in terms of their confidence and all that sort of stuff too. And then the final one I just want to bring to mind, flip it, I suppose, that I started with, no, that didn't start with this, but the second one, behaviorism, I really sort of, the dichotomy, I suppose, or the juxtaposition of this would be then ecological psychology, where instead of reality being external and objective. In a similar sense, maybe the way constructivists think about reality is socially constructed in some way, maybe. What an ecological psychology paradigm believes is that reality is basically the interweaving of relational systems of the organism, or maybe in some sense the athlete, the person, the environment, and the task at hand, and therefore, actually, I'm maybe jumping down a few pegs, or going up a few pegs again, depending on if you want to invert the pyramid. But they do essentially think that it's a system, the world operates under a system of the environment and the person interacting with one another, and acting on opportunities for action, and that defines what is possible. So in a coaching lens, this is the sort of athlete environment interaction, that coupling, where knowledge is therefore a direct perception of affordances and action, and therefore learning is adapting to the constraints of the environment. So it's like we perceive to act, and we act to perceive, that we don't take these things away. Now that's in complete contrast, obviously, to a more behaviourist view, which is in a lot of ways linked to the sort of information processing view of still learning, where it's just seen as right. There's some cues of your environment, not exact answers, but predictions perhaps of what's going to occur, and through experience should they become better orientated to make sense of that, and to reparameterize some sort of set postural skill to act in a way that works for that. And then over time, that feedback loop just goes on, and you become better and more experienced as a result of that experience, that sort of thing. Whereas with sort of like, instead of remembering it and adjusting, it's sort of about recognizing the affordances in the environment and adapting to those affordances. Knowledge comes out of adaptation, of learning how to adapt and to seek out affordances in the environment. So at the methodological level, it's about pushing athletes away from things they're not meant to do and towards the affordances of the environment for what they do want to do. So this is sort of where your sort of constraint-led approach to coaching comes in, where coaches are going to manipulate tasks that they have sort of environmental constraints, and that might be on the rules and the space, the equipment, might even be taking into account the athlete themselves and what are their organismic constraints, their height, their weight, their skill level, all those sorts of things, affective states, these sorts of things, and how they can manipulate that in such a way that pushes them towards growth. It's kind of like, if I want people to become better at doing a netball, I suppose, of how to do it, how to shoot the ball into the net, maybe rather than me coaching them posturally about what to do, is actually bring them right underneath the net and raise the net up really high, that they have to do the technique. Affordance the environment presents to them that space to do the technique, as to go right underneath the ball, in the way that they have to flick it with their hand. Again, I know I'm perfect. I'm just trying to give an example of how this works. So you're not needing to coach them, but you're pushing the environment. The session is coaching them towards something. So something good, something you want. So the ecological or dynamical systems coach, so this is interchangeable language that's used for this, but coaches with that ecological psychology paradigm in mind, they're obviously going to value that attunement to the environment, that adaptability, and really respect the ecological validity of still, and that they see still as being something that emerges and not something that is manufactured in an awfully predetermined way. So there's going to be an ethical commitment to designing contexts that promote creativity, your way of taking the kick, your way of the stroke within certain parameters. And they're still going to offer questions, and there's still going to be, to some extent, there's still going to be coaching involved in that as well, and lending your own experience. But the athlete will be empowered to find ways if at the very least in the periphery of still, to sort of manufacture their own way of doing it. Again, therefore, you need to, think about how you can create contexts that promote autonomy as well, and real game representatives is really important. A coach that really believes in ecological dynamics and has a dynamical systems sort of hat on, that constraint-led coach, they're always really start in the most representative way of performing a skill, because they teach sport through the sport, and then they sort of will try to scaffold and constrain the environment across different ability levels and for different topics, in a way that allows the reader to still have a layer of scaffolding that helps them get on, but it was still challenging them to understand still as being a whole thing. So just to round off, I won't bore you with my own sort of viewpoint on it, other than to say I have over the years experienced a sort of shift towards something that is a bit more pragmatic and a bit more about the embodied experience of still. But for you as a listener, I just want to encourage you to consider um, where this sort of fits with you and your sort of thinking around still, but also your behaviours on the sport field. I think for many of us, we could be quite guilty, as I say, of of viewing at least the metaphysics of a behaviour to some extent, but not going through each of the levels of higher order thinking that I've proposed now. So not just, is it enough to think about things at ontological lens if you haven't necessarily then grappled down at the methodological level, how you then actually, plan practices, how you feed back on mistakes, how you encourage your athletes to reflect, how you reflect on your own practice as well. Or similarly speaking, maybe thinking bottoms up. If you have really deeply held values as a coach that you want to see translated into practice, then have you sort of thought about building them into your practice and finding a paradigm that you can really anchor onto that's going to help you be better as a coach? So it's a couple of things to think about. You might even be looking for a partner paradigm, and I'm not saying to say this that they can easily be put together, but certainly there is such a thing as trees of thoughts. Trees of thought that you could be picking, and maybe we could see, well, ecological dynamics is, I'm not necessarily trying to say this is the case, but they do believe in an emergent expression of still and those sorts of things. And who's to say then that we can't lean and combine that thought with a more constructivist view of still learning and that sort of view of reality within sports. So these are the things to think about and to flesh out and to consider how well you're doing in that tree of knowledge, to coin the phrase I've just already said there already. If you are thinking about taking this further and want to delve into this more, go back to my previous episode with Mark Parkington, look at the previous episode I've done with John Lyle, as I say, just look at this area in general. You don't need to necessarily go into coaching journals to go and find it. It might just be wider conversations about reality and sort of bring it and transfer it back in. If there's some work done already by authors like Mark Parkington, etc., then great, they're doing half the work for you. But it's for you as the coach to go and think about these things and to make them not so abstract. It's hard to do sometimes, particularly when they are often these sort of conversations are often fleshed out within academic circles, which can have a problem with that. But as the coach listening who's in the trenches, it's for you to think about the practical implications of what I'm saying here. So hopefully that's helpful, guys. Go and also look at like learning theories and stuff. Sometimes the language is interchangeable. And yeah, I will see you next time.